There's a comfortable lie that's been repeated for decades, and almost everyone believes it. They say that showing emotion is a sign of strength, that saying everything you feel is courageous, that exposing yourself creates connection. But observe closely the men who truly accumulate power, influence, and control, and you'll notice something unsettling. They never do that. It's not coldness, it's not repression, it's strategy. Machiavelli already knew that in the real game of life, exposed emotion doesn't humanize, it weakens. Those who overreact relinquish control. Those who over-explain lose authority, and those who live emotionally available become predictable, easy to manipulate, easy to lead. In this video, you'll understand why self-control has always triumphed over charisma, why silence disarms more than arguments, and how powerful men transform emotion into an advantage without seeming harsh, without seeming distant, but always one step ahead. If you feel you overreact, if you realize that sometimes you lose power in your impulses, perhaps it's not a lack of strength, it's a lack of method. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. The mentor begins by making something very clear. Power is almost never lost through visible weakness, but through poorly managed emotion. This is where Machiavelli enters the scene, not as a villain, but as a cold observer of real human nature. When someone reacts impulsively, shouts, over-explains, or tries to prove their worth, they relinquish control of the situation without realizing it. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, teaches that those who master their own inner state are never at the mercy of their environment. Uncontrolled emotion creates leaks, and leaks are always exploited. The end justifies the means not as moral license, but as a pragmatic reading of the game. Those who become too emotional reveal their intentions, fears, and limitations. And those who reveal too much become predictable. Better to be feared than loved begins precisely here, in inner control. Avoiding being hated depends on composure, not justifications. The appearance of virtue may deceive for a time, but the loss of self-control reveals fragility. Ultimately, power slips through one's fingers when emotion takes the wheel. He explains that in practice, whoever controls their emotions controls you. It's that simple. It's not physical strength, it's not superior intelligence, it's emotional reading. A boss who loses their temper in meetings, a partner who reacts with excessive jealousy, a leader who is constantly on the defensive. They are all being led. The calculated use of force begins with restraint, not explosion. In the modern world, loyal and self-sufficient armies are people who trust those who maintain stability under pressure. Decisions based on real human nature stem from the understanding that emotion is a weakness when exposed. A simple example: responding to messages in the heat of anger almost always creates regret. Waiting an hour changes everything. Constant adaptability is not about changing your mind all the time, but about adjusting your behavior to the context. Those who over-explain lose respect. Those who overreact lose an advantage. The mentor smiles and says, emotional control is not coldness, it's sovereignty. Modern manipulation almost always works through well-placed emotional triggers. Indignation, fear, urgency, and guilt are the favorite buttons of those who want to control masses and individuals. When someone provokes you emotionally, they rarely want dialogue. They want a reaction. Machiavelli already warned that provoking the enemy to act prematurely is a silent victory. The person who remains silent breaks the manipulator's script. An exaggerated appearance of virtue becomes a trap. The more you try to appear good, the more controllable you become. Better to be feared than loved is not about intimidation, but about not being predictable. Avoiding being hated requires knowing when not to react. The mentor leaves it open. If emotion delivers power, then understanding how it arises in the body completely changes the game. And that's exactly where the biology behind this invisible mechanism comes in. The mentor now pulls back the veil and reveals something almost no one wants to face. The brain reacts before it thinks. Always. Emotion comes first. Reasoning follows, attempting to justify. Machiavelli intuitively understood this when discussing decisions based on real human nature, not beautiful ideals. When someone feels threatened, the body takes over, not logic. That's why heated discussions rarely produce good agreements. The end justifies the means here isn't philosophy, it's physiology. Politics, guided by reality, not ideals, begins by understanding that no one is entirely rational under pressure. Those who ignore this become easy targets. Better to be feared than loved requires first and foremost not being impulsive. Avoiding being hated demands knowing when your own body is asking for a reaction, not a strategy. Emotion doesn't ask permission to arise, it simply appears. He explains that hormones like cortisol and adrenaline brutally hijack judgment. The heart races, vision narrows, the mind enters survival mode. In this state, bad decisions seem urgent and right decisions seem too slow. The calculated use of force requires recognizing this moment and not acting within it. A practical example, important negotiations should never happen right after an emotional peak. Sleeping before responding to a tense email is worth more than any persuasion technique. Loyal armies are built by leaders who don't make hormonal decisions. The appearance of emotional virtue, like saying everything you feel, is often just disguised impulsiveness. Virtù and fortuna meet when the individual understands the right time to act. Constant adaptability begins in the body, not in speech. Modern manipulators exploit this biology with surgical precision. They know exactly when to provoke fear, urgency, or guilt to push for quick decisions. Alarmist headlines, emotional demands, and social pressures work because they speak directly to the nervous system, not to reason. Machiavelli would never ignore this detail. Controlling the emotional environment is controlling behavior. Those who react without realizing it become instruments. Those who observe win. Better to be feared than loved also means not being easily manipulated. Avoiding being hated involves not engaging in other people's emotional games. The mentor leaves a silent provocation. If the body reacts before the mind, then constant emotional exposure is not a virtue. It's strategic vulnerability. And that's exactly what modern society curiously calls authenticity. The mentor now points to a dangerous misconception of our time. Modern society sells vulnerability as absolute strength. Speaking everything, exposing everything, reacting to everything has become a sign of courage. But Machiavelli would never fall into that trap. Politics, guided by reality, not by ideals, demands discernment, not public confession. When someone transforms every emotion into a spectacle, they lose depth and authority. Better to be feared than loved begins with not emotionally bearing oneself before just anyone. Avoiding being hated involves knowing what to show and what to preserve. The appearance of emotional virtue creates quick applause, but exacts a high price later. Those who expose themselves too much become predictable characters, and predictability in the game of power is weakness disguised as sincerity. He calmly explains, when culture says be authentic, it often means be controllable. Displayed emotions become maps for the observer. Recurring anger shows triggers. Constant guilt reveals levers. Declared fear reveals limits. Decisions based on real human nature recognize this without moralizing. The end justifies the means. Here means protecting one's own emotional center. A simple example: those who vent about everything at work end up being used, not supported. Virtù and fortuna favor those who choose when to speak. The calculated use of force includes knowing when to silence feelings at the wrong moment. Loyal and dedicated armies respect leaders who don't unleash emotional instability on the group. Constant adaptability isn't about being transparent all the time. It's about being strategic. Constant emotional exposure creates an almost invisible effect. It makes you predictable. The mentor smiles and says that predictability is the greatest gift you can give a manipulator. Those who always react the same way lose room for maneuver. Machiavelli knew that the appearance of virtue must be controlled, never automatic. Better to be feared than loved also means maintaining a certain emotional mystery. Avoiding being hated requires composure, not theatricality. When someone doesn't know how you feel, they need to observe more. And those who observe more generally make fewer mistakes. The mentor leaves the hook hanging. If emotions are exploited socially, then there is an engineering behind it all, and it operates far beyond personal relationships. The mentor now broadens the perspective and shows that this was never just personal, it's systemic. The emotional engineering of society operates every day, silently, efficiently, and highly profitable. Headlines don't inform, they provoke. Algorithms don't connect, they activate specific emotions. Machiavelli would understand this as politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Whoever controls the emotional climate controls collective decisions. The end justifies the means when the goal is to capture attention and behavior. Better to be feared than loved translates here into narrative authority. Avoiding being hated requires subtlety, not direct confrontation. The appearance of virtue is used as moral packaging for emotionally toxic messages. Those who react without realizing it become pawns. Those who observe begin to leave the game. Fear, indignation, and guilt are the most valuable currencies of this system. Fear paralyzes or pushes towards hasty decisions. Indignation creates automatic engagement. Guilt keeps people trapped in narratives they didn't consciously choose. Decisions based on real human nature recognize that no one is immune to this all the time. The calculated use of force, in this context, is not reacting immediately. A simple example: urgent news almost never requires an urgent response. Waiting 24 hours changes perception. Virtù and fortuna favor those who don't succumb to collective panic. Today, one's own loyal armies are people capable of thinking outside the dominant emotional flow. Constant adaptability is knowing when to disconnect to preserve clarity. The system profits directly from emotional reactions, not reflection. Every impulsive click, every inflammatory comment, every indignant share feeds the machine. Machiavelli already warned that those who act driven by emotion usually act in the interests of others. Better to be feared than loved here means not being easily manipulated. Avoiding being hated involves not attacking the system, but not submitting to it. The appearance of collective virtue often hides perverse incentives. The mentor makes it clear getting out of external emotional control is not becoming apathetic, it's building autonomy. And for that, something that almost no one practices is necessary: strategic detachment. The mentor now pauses almost didactically and corrects a common mistake. Detachment is not apathy, it's strategic armor. Machiavelli would never confuse emotional detachment with weakness or indifference. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires understanding that those who need too much have already lost half the game. The end justifies the means here means preserving internal autonomy. It's better to be feared than loved than to depend on the emotional approval of others. Avoiding being hated requires balance, not submission. The appearance of exaggerated virtue arises precisely from the need for acceptance. Those who practice detachment observe more clearly. Those who observe clearly react less and act better. Power lies not in feeling less, but in not being dragged down by what one feels. Creating space between stimulus and response is one of the rarest skills in the modern world. The mentor explains that this space is where real power resides. When someone provokes you and you don't react immediately, something curious happens. Control changes hands. The calculated use of force begins in inner silence. A simple and practical example: upon receiving unfair criticism, writing it down, breathing, and responding the next day completely changes the dynamic. Decisions based on true human nature respect the mind's time, not the body's impulse. Loyal and selfless armies trust leaders who don't become emotionally disorganized. Virtue and fortuna meet in this invisible interval. Constant adaptability is born from pause, not haste. Observing emotions without reacting to them is a daily practice, not an innate talent. The mentor compares this to watching a wave without entering the sea. The emotion rises, threatens, makes noise, and passes. Machiavelli would understand this as self-mastery before mastering the environment. Better to be feared than loved here means being emotionally unpredictable. Avoiding being hated involves not exploding or justifying oneself. The appearance of emotional virtue is often just disguised anxiety. Those who master detachment don't lose sensitivity, they gain precision. And when someone realizes they can no longer easily reach you, they begin to lose influence. The mentor leaves the next step open-ended. When detachment becomes visible, silence begins to speak louder than any word. The mentor now lowers his tone and delivers one of the most underrated weapons of power: silence. In a noisy world, those who don't react create discomfort. Machiavelli knew that silence breaks the manipulator's rhythm because it removes the emotional fuel from the game. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, teaches that not every provocation deserves a response. The end justifies the means when the means is not to expose oneself. Better to be feared than loved stems from unpredictability, and silence is the soil where it grows. Avoiding being hated involves not escalating unnecessary conflicts. The appearance of virtue often shouts, real power observes. Those who talk too much explain themselves. Those who explain themselves too much weaken themselves. Those who speak less observe more, and those who observe more understand the game better. The mentor explains that silence forces the other person to reveal themselves. When you don't react, the other person fills the void. They talk too much, contradict themselves, show their intentions. The calculated use of force begins with restraining one's own tongue. A practical example: in tense meetings, those who wait for everyone to speak before giving their opinion usually come out on top. Decisions based on real human nature recognize that people give themselves away when they try to control the conversation. Loyal and dedicated armies respect leaders who don't compete for attention. Virtue and fortuna favor those who know how to wait. Constant adaptability is knowing when to speak, and especially when not to speak. Calmness destabilizes those who depend on its reaction. Manipulators need visible emotion to adjust their next move. When they find nothing, they become insecure. Machiavelli would understand this as removing the battlefield from its expected place. Better to be feared than loved here means not being easy to read. Avoiding being hated requires self-control, not direct confrontation. The appearance of virtue often responds too quickly. Silence, on the contrary, creates authority effortlessly. Whoever masters this art doesn't seem weak, they seem unreachable. And when silence is sustained, something curious happens. Composure begins to define who really commands the environment. The mentor now points to something almost invisible, yet decisive. Composure creates a silent advantage that few perceive. The calm man always wins because he doesn't reveal himself entirely. Machiavelli understood that politics guided by reality, not by ideals, rewards those who maintain a firm center while others expose themselves. The end justifies the means when the means is not giving away emotional clues. Better to be feared than loved stems from this disconcerting stability. Avoiding being hated involves not humiliating or confronting, only maintaining presence. The appearance of virtue is usually noisy. Composure is discreet. Those who don't change force the environment to adjust to them. And, in this adjustment, power shifts. Composure creates authority without the need for explicit force. The mentor explains that in any room, the most serene person ends up setting the pace. Agitated people look to them for guidance, even without realizing it. The calculated use of force appears precisely in the absence of effort. A practical example: in a difficult negotiation, those who don't show anxiety usually close better deals. Decisions based on real human nature recognize that visible emotion reduces bargaining power. Loyal armies follow leaders who don't become disorganized under pressure. Virtù and fortuna go hand in hand when the individual doesn't let themselves be dragged down. Constant adaptability isn't about reacting quickly, it's about maintaining clarity when everyone else loses theirs. The most serene person in the room sets the rules because no one can easily control them. Manipulators rely on reactions to calibrate the game, and composure blocks that access. Machiavelli knew that those who don't explain themselves too much become indecipherable. Better to be feared than loved here is to be respected without asking. Avoiding being hated requires a balance between firmness and silence. The appearance of emotional virtue may generate momentary empathy, but composure generates lasting authority. When someone realizes they can't destabilize you, they start acting more cautiously. The mentor leaves the next key in the air. If emotion shouldn't command, then it needs to be translated, not repressed. The mentor now makes a fine adjustment that changes everything. Emotion is not the enemy, it's a signal. The common mistake is treating feeling as an immediate order for action. Machiavelli would never recommend blind repression. He would advocate strategic interpretation. Politics, guided by reality, not by ideals, begins when someone learns to translate what they feel before acting. Fear doesn't demand automatic escape, it demands attention. Anger doesn't demand attack, it demands direction. The end justifies the means here means using emotion as a given, not as a steering wheel. Better to be feared than loved involves not reacting impulsively. Avoiding being hated requires channeling, not exploding. The appearance of emotional virtue often confuses expression with wisdom. Power arises when feeling is decoded, not displayed. Transforming fear into focus is a trainable skill. The mentor explains that fear points to where there is risk, and well-analyzed risk becomes strategy. A practical example: before an important decision, writing down exactly what scares you organizes the mind. Anger can become discipline when converted into consistent action, such as physical training, in-depth study, or silent execution. Decisions based on real human nature recognize that emotion contains raw energy. The calculated use of force lies in directing that energy. Loyal armies are built by those who transform tension into preparedness. Virtù and fortuna align when the individual uses what they feel to better structure themselves. Constant adaptability is born from this capacity for internal transmutation. To feel fully, but to act selectively, is the balance that almost no one achieves. The mentor makes it clear: denying emotion creates rigidity, obeying emotion creates chaos. Machiavelli would be on the side of those who observe, interpret, and choose. Better to be feared than loved here is not to be a hostage to one's own emotional state. Avoiding being hated involves not unloading raw feelings onto others. The appearance of emotional virtue usually demands validation. Emotional translation builds autonomy. When someone notices that you feel something but don't react automatically, something changes in the dynamic. Control returns, and at that point, calmness ceases to be a technique and becomes identity, exactly what defines the modern Stoic prince. The mentor now introduces the central figure who ties everything together up to this point: the modern Stoic prince. In a chaotic world, maintaining calm is not passivity, it is mastery. Machiavelli would understand this as politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Those who despair lose room for action. The end justifies the means when the means are sustained self-control. Better to be feared than loved arises from the ability to remain stable while the environment collapses. Avoiding being hated requires not reacting like the crowd. The appearance of emotional virtue is common, emotional discipline is rare. The modern prince stands out not for his speeches, but for his posture. He does not pursue external control because he already masters the internal one. Training for chaos, not comfort, is one of the hallmarks of this profile. The mentor explains that those who only function in stable environments collapse when pressured. Decisions based on real human nature accept that the world is unstable by definition. The calculated use of force appears when someone prepares for adverse scenarios, not when they improvise emotionally. A practical example: simple routines, such as waking up at the same time, training the body, and maintaining periods of mental silence, create invisible resilience. Loyal and dedicated armies trust leaders who don't panic. Virtù and fortuna favor those who are ready before the crisis. Constant adaptability is born from training, not luck. Self-control is the highest form of power because it depends on no one but yourself. The mentor makes it clear that those who master themselves rarely need to master others. Machiavelli saw this as the basis of all lasting authority. Better to be feared than loved here is to be respected for stability. Avoiding being hated involves not imposing control, but inspiring restraint. The appearance of virtue may convince outwardly. Self-control convinces by example. When someone realizes that nothing throws you off balance, they adjust their own behavior. The Stoic prince does not react to prove strength. He acts when it is unavoidable. And when this pattern becomes a habit, the strategy ceases to be theory and transforms into a practical way of life. The mentor now descends from the conceptual plane to the ground of real life. Strategy is not pretty talk, it's repeated behavior. Machiavelli always made it clear that announcing moves weakens the position. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, teaches that those who talk too much create resistance even before acting. The end justifies the means when the means are discretion. It's better to be feared than loved. It begins with not explaining every step. Avoiding being hated involves acting without fanfare. The appearance of virtue usually promotes itself. True virtue is revealed in the results. Decisions based on real human nature recognize that people react more to what they see than to what they hear. Those who remain silent and execute advance without interference. Observing more and speaking less isn't shyness, it's strategic reading of the environment. The mentor explains that those who speak too early compromise too early. A simple example: Before giving your opinion in a meeting, observing who speaks, who hesitates, and who exposes themselves already reveals the power dynamic of the room. The calculated use of force appears when speech is used as a tool, not as a reflex. Your own loyal armies are built when actions are consistent and predictable, not emotions. Virtu and fortuna walk hand in hand when the word is rare and precise. Constant adaptability requires active listening, not automatic reaction. Those who master this dynamic are rarely caught off guard. Resisting the urge to respond immediately is one of the greatest acts of personal sovereignty. The mentor reinforces that silence and intentional action are not the absence of attitude. They are long-term stances. Machiavelli knew that whoever reacts always plays into the other's hands. Better to be feared than loved. Here is to be respected for strategic predictability, not emotional predictability. Avoiding being hated requires consistency, not justification. The appearance of virtue may please in the short term, but silent discipline builds lasting power. When silence becomes a habit and action becomes a conscious choice, the whole of life changes rhythm. And at that point, strategy ceases to be something to be studied. It becomes something to be lived. Now, the inevitable question is simple and uncomfortable. How many times have you lost an advantage because you reacted too quickly? How many decisions have you made in the heat of the moment, only to realize later that you were playing someone else's game? Machiavelli never spoke of power as something external, but as a direct consequence of internal mastery. When you learn to create space between stimulus and response, everything changes. Relationships change. Negotiations change. The way people treat you changes. Emotion ceases to be the enemy and becomes information. Silence ceases to be weakness and becomes a stance. And calmness ceases to be a personality trait and becomes a strategic tool. Apply this practically. Observe before speaking, wait before reacting, act without announcing. Start small. A difficult conversation, a postponed decision, a sustained silence where there was previously justification. Ask yourself, who is in control now? You or impulse? You or external pressure? Power is not about shouting louder, nor about convincing everyone. Power is about not being easily triggered. It's about maintaining composure when the environment wants to pull you into chaos. It's about acting by choice, not by reflex. If this content resonated with you, then you've already realized living this way requires practice, awareness, and strategy. And that's exactly what we continue to build here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning how to think, act, and position yourself based on reality, not on comfortable illusions. The game doesn't stop. The question is, will you continue reacting, or will you start leading?